Imagine you are 93 years old, standing in the garden you have known for most of your life. You reach for a branch that is just a little too high. Your foot slips, and suddenly you are on the stone path. For a few seconds, you do not know whether you have broken a wrist, a hip, or something worse. Your wife is beside you, but she cannot lift you. An ambulance may be coming. A hospital may be next. And somewhere in the back of your mind is the thought very few people want to say out loud. What if you do not come home? What if one ordinary fall is the moment that decides whether you spend the rest of your life in your own house or in a facility you never planned to live in? 2 years ago, that man on the ground was my husband, Kenji. He was 93. He had been reaching for a branch he had no business reaching for, and he came down hard on the same stone path we have had since 1958. For about 4 seconds before he spoke, I thought I already knew how the rest of our lives would go. A hospital. Then, most likely, a facility. Not because I wanted that. Because when a man that age falls that hard and his wife cannot lift him, it can become the beginning of a very different life. But Kenji broke his wrist. Nothing else. 11 days later, he was sleeping in his own bed again, and he has slept in it every night since. This morning, as I am recording this, he is back in that same garden reaching for branches again. For a long time, I thought we had simply been lucky. I do not think that anymore, because when I look carefully at those 11 days, who came to help, what had already been arranged, what we did not have to decide in a panic, what documents were already signed and sitting in a drawer, I realized something. None of it had happened by accident. We had built a plan. We just had never called it one. And if you want to remain in your own home into your 80s or 90s, the important time to build that plan is not after you fall. It is years before. So I want to show you exactly what ours looked like. Not the version people imagine when they hear Okinawa and old age. Not tea, tranquility, or good genes. I mean the specific, ordinary, sometimes tedious decisions we made over 30 years, decisions that may determine whether after your own fall or hospital stay, you return to your own bed or never truly return home at all. When people from outside Okinawa hear how our elders often stay out of nursing homes, even quite old, even living with only a spouse or entirely alone, they tend to reach for one of two explanations. Either it's cultural Japanese families simply take care of their own, they assume, or it's genetic, some fortunate biology the rest of the world doesn't share. I understand why those explanations are appealing. Both explanations let everyone else off the hook a little too easily, I think. Neither one requires anything to be done differently. Culture and genetics are things you either have or you don't. You can't go out this afternoon and acquire a different grandmother, but I don't think either explanation survives a close look at an actual house. On an actual Tuesday, where an actual old man is still sleeping in his own bed 2 years, after a fall that should, by most accounts, have ended that. What I want to show you instead is a plan for specific, deliberate pieces, each one built years before it was needed. None of them requiring you to be Japanese or Okinawan or lucky or blessed with some gene the rest of the world missed out on. My husband and I built ours without a name for it. I'm going to give it one now because I think a plan without a name is very easy to forget you're supposed to be building. On the morning of Kenji's fall, I did not call an ambulance first. I called Etsuko. That may sound strange to you. Etsuko is not a nurse. She is 70 years old and lives 6 minutes away, and she is one of 4 women I have met with nearly every week since 1988. We call it a Moai, a small circle, formed young, that simply doesn't stop meeting. 36 years, most Tuesdays, tea and small complaints, and nothing urgent at all. Until suddenly it was the most urgent phone call of my year. I called her because I needed someone at the house within minutes. Not within the hour it would take our daughter to drive up from the city. Etsuko arrived before the ambulance did. She sat with me. She knew, without me explaining, exactly which neighbor had a car free that morning in case we needed a second one. She also knew, because we have spent 36 years learning this kind of thing about each other, which of our friends would want to be called immediately, and which would only worry uselessly and should be told after, once we knew more. Here is the part of this piece that I think gets missed most often. Moai formed in a moment of need is not the same thing as a Moai formed decades earlier. If I had tried to build that kind of trust the week Kenji fell, it would not have existed yet. It takes years of ordinary, unremarkable Tuesdays before a group becomes the kind of circle someone can call at 7 in the morning without hesitating, and before you become that circle for someone else. Two, because I have made that same 6-minute drive for Etsuko twice in the other direction. What this actually costs and what it actually costs. I want to be very concrete here because I think build a Moai can sound lovely and vague and useless, the kind of advice nobody can act on. So it costs almost nothing. Tea, sometimes a small snack we take turns bringing. What it costs instead is time and regularity the same day. Most weeks, for years, even the weeks nothing is wrong. That regularity is the entire mechanism. A friendship you see twice a year cannot become a Moai. A friendship you see nearly every week for a decade can. This is the piece of the plan I'd urge you to start first, precisely because it's the slowest one to build. You do not need 5 people. You do not need a Japanese word for it. What you need is 2 or 3 people who would come to your house within the hour if you called, and who you would do the same for. If you don't currently have that, today is the day that circle is furthest from being ready, which makes today the day to start it, not the day you'll wish you had. If I were starting today at your age, whatever that is, here is exactly what I would do. Pick one person, a neighbor, an old friend you've lost touch with, someone from a class or a church or a garden club, and ask them to something small and repeating. Not a dramatic reunion. A standing coffee the same morning every week for no stated reason. Say yes to it, even when you don't feel like going. The whole plan depends on the even when you don't feel like it part. That is what turns a friendship into a circle. Here is something I did not fully appreciate until that afternoon in the hospital waiting room. Kenji and I had, 3 years earlier, sat down with our daughter and written out, quite plainly, what each of us wanted if something like this happened. Not a legal document exactly, though we did register with the local long-term care office as well, but a conversation written down about what recovering at home meant to us and what we did not want to happen automatically simply because a hospital had a bed and a policy. I did not understand until I needed it how much that removed from an already frightening day. Nobody in that hospital corridor was guessing what Kenji would have wanted. Nobody had to make a rushed decision under pressure, the kind that too often defaults to the safest looking option, which in practice tends to mean a facility, simply because nobody had time to consider anything else. And a tired family at midnight will almost always choose the option that feels like it can't be blamed on them later. Researchers who study this call it advanced care planning, and while much of the research focuses on people already living in care facilities, the pattern that keeps showing up is consistent. When preferences are discussed and written down calmly in advance, care tends to better match what the person actually wanted. In panic-driven decisions, the kind made in a hospital hallway at midnight by exhausted people who love you but are terrified, become less likely to override them. There is a second, quieter part to this piece, and it is the part I think matters just as much. Around the same time we wrote down our wishes, we also enrolled properly in Japan's long-term care insurance system, Keigo Hoken, and had our needs formally assessed well before we thought we'd need to use it. This meant that when Kenji came home with his wrist in a cast, care manager who already knew our situation could arrange a visiting nurse and a few days of home help within 48 hours, rather than us discovering the entire system for the first time while exhausted and frightened, filling out forms neither of us could concentrate on. What this actually looks like, step by step, if you want to build this piece of the plan, here is the order I would do it in. First, have the conversation itself, just the two of you, or you and whoever you trust most, about what recovering at home would need to look like and what you specifically do not want decided for you by default. Again, write it down, even informally, and give a copy to whoever would be making decisions if you couldn't. Third, find out this varies by country, so I can't tell you the exact office, whatever your local equivalent of a long-term care assessment is, and go through it while you're still healthy, not after. Fourth, revisit the conversation every year or two, because what you want at 70 is not always what you want at 90. I want to say this plainly because I think it is the least glamorous and most useful part of the whole plan. The paperwork done calmly on an ordinary Tuesday is not the same paperwork done in a panic on the worst afternoon of your year. It is the same forms. It is not the same experience, and it is not, in the end, the same outcome. Let me give you the actual sequence of that day, because I think the specifics matter more than the principle. Kenji was in the emergency room by 9 in the morning. By 11, the wrist was set and splinted, and a hospital coordinator came to talk to us about next steps. The phrase they used gently to mean the facility question, because our care assessment was already on file because the coordinator could see in a system that Kenji had already been evaluated and approved for home visiting care. The entire conversation lasted perhaps 6 minutes. She simply confirmed the existing plan and made 2 phone calls. Families without that paperwork already filed, she told me afterward, often spend 2 or 3 days in that same hospital bed, not because they're medically required to, but because nobody has arranged anywhere else for them to go, and a hospital will not discharge someone into nothing. Those 2 or 3 extra days, I've since learned, are themselves a known risk. The longer an older person stays in a hospital bed, the more strength and independence they tend to lose, entirely apart from whatever injury brought them there in the first place. The paperwork, in other words, wasn't just convenient. It may have been the thing that kept a wrist fracture from becoming a much longer, much more dangerous hospital stay. Kenji broke his wrist. He did not break his hip. I have come to believe that difference decided almost everything about the 11 days and possibly about the rest of his life. Researchers who study falls in older adults have found, somewhat surprisingly, that one of the simplest measurements available, how hard a person can squeeze a handheld grip dynamometer, a small device that cost perhaps $30 or $40, turns out to be one of the strongest and most consistent predictors of fall risk, physical independence, and recovery capacity in the years that follow. Arguably more reliable than a person-based. Weak grip strength doesn't cause a fall directly, but it tends to travel alongside weaker legs, poorer balance, and slower reflexes, exactly the combination that decides whether a stumble becomes a bruise or becomes the injury that ends independent living. Kenji has never lifted a weight in his life, not deliberately, but he has hauled fishing nets by hand for 70 years. Waters our garden with a bucket rather than a hose, and still climbs the 2 steps to our front door a dozen times a day rather than living on one floor, as many people his age eventually choose to. None of it was designed as exercise. All of it, without either of us planning it that way, kept his hands, his legs, and his balance working right up until the afternoon he needed them. What this actually means if you don't have 70 years of fishing nets behind you, there's a fishing net. I don't say any of this to suggest hauling fishing nets is a realistic plan for most people watching this. It isn't, and I'm not going to pretend it is, but the underlying principle translates easily, and it doesn't require a boat. Strength built and maintained specifically in the hands, legs, and balance, not overall fitness in a vague sense. But those 3 things specifically appears to matter enormously for whether a fall in your 80s or 90s is a minor setback or a life-changing one. For the hands, something as ordinary as squeezing a soft rubber ball or a cheap spring-loaded hand gripper a few minutes a day is enough to matter. The research isn't asking for hours in a gym, it's asking for consistency. For the legs, the plainest version is simply this: stand up from a chair without using your hands and sit back down 10 times once a day. It sounds too small to matter. It is not. For balance, standing on one foot while brushing your teeth, holding onto the counter if you need to at first, is something Etsuko's late husband did every single morning for the last 15 years of his life, and something I have started doing myself rather later than I should have. None of this costs anything. That's worth saying plainly, because I know how much is sold to older people under the promise of preventing falls, memberships, devices, programs, subscriptions to apps that count your steps and tell you what you already knew. What actually moves the needle, according to the people who study this, is far smaller and far cheaper than what gets marketed to you. And it is almost insultingly simple. Squeeze something, stand up 10 times, balance on one foot while your teeth get clean. That's the whole list. Let me tell you about Etsuko's husband, Hiroshi, because I think it makes the point better than I can. He was not an athletic man. He worked in an office his whole life, sat at a desk, complained about his knees for decades before anyone thought to do anything about it. In his late 70s, a doctor in Naha told him, almost in passing, to try standing on one leg while he brushed his teeth, both morning and night. He thought it was a silly thing to be told by a doctor he was paying good money to see. He did it anyway because Etsuko made him. 15 years later, at 91, he was still walking to the fish market himself, twice a week, on legs that never once gave out from under him, not because of any single dramatic intervention, but because of roughly 2 minutes a day, repeated for 5,000 mornings in a row. That is the entire secret, if you want to call it that. Not intensity, repetition. Gym membership you use twice a month will do less for you than 90 seconds a day. You never skip. Being honest about what this doesn't do. I want to be honest with you here, the way I'd want someone honest with me. None of this guarantees you won't fall. Kenji still fell. What it appears to change is what happens after the fall, whether your body absorbs it as a wrist or surrenders it as a hip. It is also, unlike most things on this list, something a person can meaningfully improve starting in their 60s or 70s, well before it's tested, which is exactly why I'd urge you not to wait until after your own fall to start. Our daughter lives 40 minutes away. On the morning Kenji fell, she was at her office when I called, and she left within minutes, no questions asked, because a missed call from me at that hour was already on its own enough information. That instant understanding did not happen by accident. For over a decade, she and I have spoken by phone at almost exactly the same time each evening, not because either of us has urgent news most days, but because the habit itself has become the safety mechanism. If I don't call, she calls. If she doesn't hear from me by a certain hour, something is wrong, and she already knows it before I've had to explain anything. I mention this because I think many families believe closeness requires geographic proximity, and it doesn't. Not entirely. What it requires is predictability reliable enough that an interruption in the pattern is itself the alarm. A weekly video call at the same time, every weekly video call, without fail, does more for this piece of the plan than an unpredictable visit every few months, even if the visit involves considerably more travel and good intention. If you're building this piece from nothing, start smaller than you think you need to. A single fixed check-in once a week, same day, same rough hour, is enough to establish the pattern. You are not trying to talk for an hour. You are trying to make the absence of that call someday mean something to both of you immediately. Here is what I did not understand until I sat down to write all of this out for you. None of these 4 pieces does very much on its own. The Moai, without advanced planning, still leaves a family guessing in the hospital hallway. Advanced planning without physical strength still can't prevent the hip fracture that makes the plan somewhat moot. Strength without a reliable circle of contact still leaves someone lying on a floor for 2 days before anyone notices. And contact without either of the other two just means someone finds out about the crisis a little sooner, without anything in place to soften it. It was the combination, quietly built over 3 decades, one piece at a time, without ever being written down as a plan until I did it for you just now, that turned what should have been a frightening, faltering afternoon into 11 ordinary days and a full recovery at home. I don't want to leave you with the impression that this plan guarantees anything. It doesn't. Kenji broke his wrist that day. If the angle of his fall had been slightly different, none of these 4 pieces would have mattered nearly as much. A serious hip fracture or a stroke can overwhelm even the best prepared family, and I have watched that happen to people I love very much. People who had built circles and plans every bit as carefully as we had, and it still wasn't enough. What this plan appears to do, as far as I can honestly tell, is shift the odds and buy time, delaying the crisis, softening it when it does arrive, and removing the panic-driven decisions that too often turn a recoverable situation into a permanent one. It is not a guarantee. I don't think anything at this age is, and I'd be lying to you if I said otherwise. I've wondered why more families elsewhere don't build something similar quite deliberately well before it's needed. I don't think anyone is hiding this from you. I don't think there's a company or an industry keeping this quiet, the way there might be with other things. I think it's simply unglamorous work with no urgency attached to it until suddenly there's a great deal of urgency attached to it. Writing down your wishes on a calm Tuesday afternoon compete for most people's attention with 100 more pressing things. It rarely wins that competition until it's too late for the timing to help as much. There's also, I think, a quieter reason. None of these four pieces looks like elder care while you're building them. Tea with three friends looks like tea with three friends. 10 minutes standing up from a chair looks like nothing at all. A phone call with your daughter at the same hour every evening looks like affection, not infrastructure. Nobody watching Kenji water the garden with a bucket in his 70s would have called it fall prevention. It only reveals itself as a plan decades later, on the one afternoon it's tested, which is exactly why it's so easy to postpone. It never announces itself as urgent until the day it already had to have been finished. If you'd like it simply, here is the whole plan again, small enough to act on. One, find or start a circle of 2 or 3 people who would come within the hour. And be that for them too. 2, have the conversation about what you'd want, write it down, and look into your local long-term care assessment before you need it. 3, a few minutes a day for grip, legs, and balance, starting now, not after your own fall. 4, one fixed, predictable check-in each week with the person who would come if you didn't answer. Pick whichever one feels most possible this month. Not all 4 at once. Kenji is in the garden again this morning, reaching for branches he has no business reaching for, his cast long since removed. I've stopped trying to talk him out of it. Some things about a person don't change, and I've decided that's probably fine. Tell me, if you'd like, which piece of this you already have and which one feels furthest away. I read what people share. Next time, I'd like to tell you about the conversation Kenji and I actually had. Word for word as best I remember it. The afternoon we wrote down what we wanted. It was harder than I expected and shorter than I feared. Thank you for sitting with me this morning.